space are actually not really well prepared to manage this risk. And over the next hour or so, we're going to explore the situation, what steps we can take to mitigate that risk, and we'll enter into a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So as things come to mind, as you hear different topics, please feel free to either pop something in the chat box or just write it down for the end of the call. I wanted to just touch base quickly on who SAGES is. We're actually part of the CMPA family. Our goal is to support the broader healthcare team, so the physicians and their comprehensive teams. And we really focus on how we can help make things safer for patients, for clinics, and for staff. We actually have 3 lines of businesses. Practice management, as Andrew mentioned, I'm the director of that, and we are currently focusing on cybersecurity and privacy risks. We also have the SAGES Safety Institute. They're developing some phenomenal programs that explore and support culture, communication, team dynamics, which are also important at these times. And then we have a high-risk specialty, and they focus on reducing risk in the OR. So our objectives for today, we just have a couple. We'd like to take a look at the current snapshot of the cybersecurity landscape as it pertains to healthcare, and take a look at how cyber criminals are actually targeting the healthcare space. We'll share some cyber safe habits that you can start doing right away that will help reduce your risk. And we'll take a quick peek at SAGES Shield, which is a platform that we have developed to help close the gap on our knowledge as healthcare professionals. So it's a changing world, and I don't need to tell any of you how quickly our clinical environment is evolving. It doesn't matter if you work in a clinic or a hospital, a community. Technology is evolving almost faster than we can keep up with it. It's part of most aspects of our day. You know, our communication, whether it be with our colleagues, our nurses, pharmacists, our patients, it just has really changed the conversation. And this technology is phenomenal. It's very much helped us have efficiencies, accuracy, access, also important in providing optimal care. It's also meant that patient medical data and their PHI is very portable. It can be accessed from wherever we are doing that. And we all know we can just log on and check EMRs, EHRs, lab values, referrals. That has introduced very much risk when it comes to technology in the healthcare space, especially when those technologies are layered, often on infrastructure that's not necessarily been designed to support safety and a tight resistance to cybersecurity threats, especially in a small clinic. So as we look at the benefits of technology, we also have to look at the risks they bring, and cyber criminals are really working to leverage every time we add technology. And what's their goal? Well, as the second point says here, their goal is to access PHI. It's becoming much more valuable. Healthcare files are worth up to $1,000 on something that's called the dark web, that underbelly of the World Wide Web. And if we compare that to, say, a credit card number, it's been stated that it goes for around $5 a number. And that surprised me because it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, how to protect our credit card numbers. We compare that to PHI, it's a very different story. So why is PHI growing in value? Well, it's all about extorting money and profit. When you encrypt PHI, it actually initiates a critical situation. You can't access patient data. Healthcare is a very motivated space to try to get operations back so we can continue to provide care. And it's also a high ticket item outside of clinic walls. It's not just famous patients that cyber criminals are looking to get data on. It's anybody who has a complete record. And that is why it's smaller clinics are just as I guess impacted with the cybersecurity situation as the larger hospitals, which we would somehow expect. There's less security often. Sometimes the networks aren't quite as tight, and training is minimal, if at all. So it's a very attractive ticket. So as we're going to take a look at the rights that all of our patients have to that privacy and their patient personal health information, and why we have a responsibility to keep up with those changing legislations. They have to change. As risk goes up, the legislations are meant to protect our patients. So that is why we have to stay updated with what our responsibilities are and certainly what the consequences are. So we're going to take a minute now to look at who is really at risk of cyber attacks and breaches. So the answer is really everyone, and it wouldn't be so much a surprise if we're listening to the news. It's happening everywhere. Every province and territory, every size clinic, large and small, are being attacked by cyber criminals. No one is safe. And according to Raheel Qureshi, he's another Canadian cybersecurity consultant, he says the healthcare sector is now targeted more than any other industry in the country. And in fact, more than 48% of the security breaches in Canada last year happened in healthcare. And you might have heard of some of those breaches. There's the Life Labs in Ontario, where 15 million people's privacy was affected. 93,000 of those patients were from Saskatchewan. There was the eHealth ransomware that affected Saskatchewan health card holders just at the end of 2019. Experts are still not aware of the depth of that breach. You know, it was stopped, but they had planted some snoopingware. So we're not quite sure if that situation is over or if it will continue. And the missing laptop that led to 600,000 records being stolen and an $11 million class action lawsuit in Alberta. So the situations, there's many of them that we could speak about, but it is certainly telling about how frequently these breaches are occurring. Aaron, I'm not sure if you had anything to add on this topic.
You know, I think there's a couple of elements here. The fact is that small clinics are kind of targeted from so many different ways. So sometimes we hear about these breaches, Leanne, and you know, you bring up Life Labs, and it's a good example, or in the States, long-term care homes that have been targeted. And I think it's important to think about the fact that small clinics are targeted in more ways than one. It may be that organizations are seeing breaches because they're large and attractive, but sometimes when we're using public email services, shared services, common technology, these breaches are applying all the way down to small clinics and groups of clinics as well. So size doesn't always matter when we're talking about these breaches.
Exactly. And just to, I guess, to highlight the severity of this in Canada, I'm just going to show you this next little slide here. And this is actually something posted this past March. It's still on the website. It's from the Canadian Cybersecurity Centre, which is a federal agency really governed to manage this. Things were so significant in healthcare that they struck their own division for healthcare specifically for the first time. They meet weekly, talking with cybersecurity experts across the country just to monitor what types of attacks are happening, what the mitigations are, the patches that are required. You certainly can visit them. They will offer a wealth of information. Some of it's very technical, but it is telling as to how significant the concern is from all levels, government as well as providers as well. Maybe we'll just ask a quick question. Cindy has a poll for you.
Yeah, so when we've been engaging in these discussions, and yesterday as well, we could like to ask to poll to see what the audience says. So you can either raise your hand if you feel comfortable with it in your chat function, or if you're not comfortable with that's okay as well. But we just were interested to know how many people have ever experienced a cyber breach. Maybe in your clinic, it might be in your home, specifically around the clinic environment. And I'll let you think about that. And just to give you a bit of an idea, when we did this yesterday with the group and a lot of our other engagements as well, it comes back, those poll results come back at 1 in 3 people have actually experienced a breach. So they've been attacked, they've been breached, and they've had to deal with the aftermath of that.
All right, shall we go on? Yeah. All righty. So that really speaks to this next slide, and that is a quote, and it's really quite telling as to the situation we find ourselves in. Well, first of all, cybersecurity is not an IT issue; it's a patient safety issue, and I think we all understand why that was. If our files are encrypted and we can't access them, we can't see recent prescriptions and lab results and history and plan of care, it really does tie our hands to provide safe care, let alone any care at all. The other issue is around, in terms of patient safety, is the ability to be able to speak to the files as they are encrypted. So encryption is one thing, and then breaching their privacy and having them potentially land in a situation where they're actually losing their identity. Somebody has taken their data and converted it to an illegal file where they open mortgages. That can take years to recover from. So we've got a couple of angles to look at the patient safety issue. The real statement here is that it's not about if you will be breached, it's really when. And some of the data that we just went through would really be telling about this. Aaron, do you have any thoughts on the sort of if the versus when in the clinics that you deal with in terms of remediation?
You know, the fact is that clinics are kind of stuck in between a little bit of a rock and a hard place. Clinics have the obligations to put into place fairly robust cybersecurity and privacy controls, both because we've got regulatory obligations and because of the nature of the data that we deal with. And so when we take the adage, it's not if you will be breached, it's when you will be breached, this kind of calls home to clinics on two fashions. One is that many small and medium-sized clinics are still operating kind of like a small office or a home business might look, and we don't always have those types of robust controls in place. And one of the other challenges is that we've got those significant expectations. So we're looking at a landscape now, as you're describing, Leanne, where, you know, the threat posture, the threat landscape looks worse than it did a year ago. And the need for healthcare organizations which are being targeted is even more significant to ensure that people, process, technology are all working together to help ensure that security and privacy are protected effectively.
Excellent. And as you just touched on some of the consequences of breaches in the clinical space, and we'll focus on clinics because our understanding is that's mostly who's here today. You know, we've addressed the patient safety, the ransomware, the privacy breach, where you know, the theft of identity and the stress that would bring to an individual, a patient of ours. There's also financial and legal consequences. That's no surprise there when we're talking privacy breaches, but also from a cybersecurity perspective. For instance, that Life Labs breach, that was a cost $282 per record to recover from. So it's, you know, if we're talking 15 million, that's a lot of dollars. If we're talking a clinic with a few thousand patients, it's still a lot of money. Payment of ransom to access files, it's still happening. Well, we're very motivated, as I said earlier, to get our gears in flow and access to our data again. And sometimes the feeling is to pay it and then get on with it. And then, of course, interruption of service. Well, that also goes without saying. We have the financial and legal consequences. So the ability for the lawyers and to remediate and go forward is a concern. The cost to recover medical records versus, say, other industry records is almost 3 times higher than the cross-industry average of $148 per record. So, Aaron, did you have anything to add? I know that there's the reputation and stress, and I know you're quite passionate about that. If you wanted to maybe pop in there on that topic.
Yeah, I think that's significant, Leanne. Sometimes we think, you know, it's not really about the value of the records being monetized on the dark web. It's about what's the confidence that your partners and your patients have in your ability to operate. And what we've seen in other environments, both in healthcare and outside of healthcare, is that there is a lasting impact in terms of how people choose to engage. And in healthcare, we entrust a whole bunch of information in electronic format with providers without necessarily thinking about what that means if it's breached. And so that reputational injury means that how comfortable are clinicians having patients share data with them, that might actually be impacted. And I think that of all of the consequences for a breach, the implications for healthcare practitioners around reputation and trust are important to consider.
Oh, thank you. So maybe we'll take a quick look at basically how do cyber criminals target healthcare? Well, certainly in terms of the critical infrastructure, denial of service, where they're just lambasting, I'd call it, ports and really making the whole functionality break under the stress of that kind of load. Of course, malware that go in and either encrypt or watch and gather information that's then used for more pointed attacks are a really big concern. You know, our critical infrastructures, as we all know, are valuable to things like natural disasters and human error. It's just the cyber text has added another layer of concern that can happen at any time. And it's very individual. It's not sort of the whole country necessarily like we would see, or a region where natural disaster gets a lot of support. This is quite focused. In terms of prevention, working with professionals like Aaron to really make sure those firewalls are commercial and kept up to date, they play a big role. I will say that there's a lot of effort that goes into that part, especially with the large organizations, and cyber criminals often take a less time-consuming and perhaps even an easier approach, and that is to target human vulnerabilities. We would call that type of targeting social engineering or phishing. I'm sure you've all experienced a phish. I can't imagine many of us going a week without getting something in our email. It's getting better now in terms of some of the filters that are being applied by our providers of our email systems. But they're still getting through. They're getting more creative. They're getting more, specialized. And because we are human and we have our humanness, we are going to be fallible, and there are mistakes that happen. It's really a matter of being very diligent to understand how these social engineering attacks are done, how that phishing looks, the fact that it comes through not just email, but messages on our text messages as well. And it can follow us home. I'm not sure, Aaron, if you have anything specific to add, or Cindy, around that social engineering and phishing piece.
Yeah, I do. And I want to talk to that denial of service piece too, because again, I'm putting on this hat. How does it apply in small clinics and healthcare organizations? And the first comment I'd make about the social engineering and the phishing is we need to recognize that there's two types. There's the kind of target of opportunity types of phishes that we all have seen, right? Your password has expired, or the free gift card. But the targeted ones towards professionals are quite different. We do phishing as simulations, and in our experience, professional entities, engineers, doctors, lawyers, executives are great candidates because you are more likely to click on something that's of interest to you, whether it's an offer for a free stethoscope with Wi-Fi connectivity, or whether it looks like it's coming from a partner. Professionals are targeted for social engineering and phishing attacks. And in some cases, we see upwards of 1 in 4 people clicking when they are highly targeted and focused on the content. So in Saskatchewan, it wouldn't surprise us to see that there was something targeting Saskatchewan doctors, clinicians, physicians, healthcare practitioners with messaging that was unique to that region. The other thing I wanted to mention, as you were talking about denial of service, we don't just think of this as somebody trying to knock something offline, like happened with the 110 long-term care homes in the States, or Cindy, you talked yesterday about in the UK, where hospitals were impacted. But candidly, any privacy or security incident in a healthcare environment can be a denial of service, because if we think our EMR is breached, what are we going to do? We need to disconnect it. We need to take it offline. So we may be losing access to clinical systems, to patient records, while we are trying to figure out what a breach looks like, just because somebody might have a virus on a workstation or a computer. It's not always somebody trying to knock us offline. So these two things around targeting of healthcare are relevant, because we can be successful as hackers when we target them, and even a virus can sometimes result in a system being knocked offline while IT people are trying to recover.
And when we look at the whole phishing concept of really tapping into that individual, we're all working in a very stressful environment. Healthcare is a little different than the average industry out there. We had something like COVID on top of it, and all of a sudden our attention is drawn in many different directions. So it's really like a perfect storm, where we really have to raise awareness not only to the risk, but also to how to mitigate that risk and how to train our staff to help avoid them. I just wanted to touch base really quickly. When I mentioned about phishing getting more specific, there's something called whaling now, where they actually go in and impersonate a CEO or a manager. We actually had that happen at Sagis, where we received an email from one of our leadership that looked very typical, to the same kind of tone. Our team was trained, so they didn't click on it, but it was really quite startling that somebody could get into our system and be able to present that type of a breach. And that is happening in the clinic space as well, where something's coming from a physician or the clinic administrator as well. And then once, as we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of the phishing, sometimes with that phishing, we're being asked to enter in our email and our passwords. Once a criminal entity has a match, like a password and our email, they do something that's called credential stuffing. Often we engage with apps that get breached. I know I have with, I couldn't think of a couple of them now, but they really, they get breached and all of the data they store is then available on the dark web for purchase. So we end up with millions and millions of those combinations. Criminals just take them and stuff them into your password logins using high-level computers. And the Canadian Revenue Agency, the CRA, had a breach around mid-August where that occurred. They found thousands of users who had been reusing their password and email combinations, and because of that, were successfully breached. Same kinds of attacks are happening in the clinic, so it's another reason to be very diligent with how we manage passwords, and Cindy will speak to that in a few minutes. So we did have a poll, speaking of passwords.
Yeah, so our second poll today was just to get you guys to think a little bit about, have you ever reused a password? Have you ever used it for more than one account, or have you ever shared a password? So maybe in your clinic, you provide your nurse, your frontline staff, your clinic manager with your password so they can go in and renew your medical licensing, or so that they can go in and set you up with something, or so that they can go into the EMR and set up the next patient so that when you walk in, everything is set up for you. So has there ever been a time when you have shared a password or reused it? Just take a minute to think about that.
Let's.
And I'd like to say that, so as we do this poll many times, what we see is this happens over and over, and the majority of people have shared a password or they do reuse their password. And we have been, prior to all of our cybersecurity training and whatnot too, we have all been victim to that as well. And as the landscape evolves and progresses, we've become more and more diligent, but we have all been guilty of that as well.
And you can imagine with all of this discussion around, passwords, how we use it, whether we click on a link or not, while we do have technology in place that is getting better, and I guess, Aaron, you'd agree with that, it is evolving and trying to keep up with the risk and the times, the very real reality is that humans, us, we are the weakest link and we are the strongest defense when it comes to decreasing cybersecurity risks. We are actually the firewall.
Oh,
And a well-prepared and alert line of human defense, that's the individuals, is really critical to protect your patients and your clinic against cyber attacks. Aaron, did you have something to comment on in terms of this piece in particular?
Yeah, and I was smiling to myself when Cindy was asking the password question, because I've done it too. I've been guilty of reusing passwords in the past, and I just wanted to, at the risk of doing a Rick Mercer rant, I wanted to share with the audience the fact that this is one of the most fundamental challenging areas. In the past 4 months during the era of the pandemic, the most common breach that clients are coming back to us with are the types of things that Leanne and Cindy are talking about, whaling or spear phishing attacks where a senior person was compromised. And when we come in and we're doing the incident and breach response, we say, what happened? Number one with the bullet is that the passwords were either not really secure, and on top of that, we're not using multi-factor authentication. So those two things are such a huge driver in terms of core controls. There's about 8 or 9 things like that clinics should have on their shorthand. What are the top 10 lists? But number one with the bullet is certainly around making sure that people are well trained and aware of the practices. Don't reuse your passwords, use password management, use multi-factor authentication. Those types of things are education and training. Yes, there's a technology domain behind it, but if people are not on board with building a culture of cybersecurity, even in small clinics, being conscious of what it means to share information, to connect to Wi-Fi, to work from home, these are the types of outcomes that could happen.
Well, and speaking of preparation, sorry, Cindy, you go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry, I just wanted to piggyback off Aaron's comments there for 1 second. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is how many of you have passwords underneath your keyboard. We go into clinics all the time and you lift up a keyboard and there's the passwords to your EMR, to your clinic systems, all written underneath. So, you know, when we're talking password managers, I'm being sarcastic now, but that's not the type of password manager we want to see, right? And we need to really be diligent about that because we have seen cyber criminals attacking that. There's a great example of the Hawaii Emergency Response Agency who they had a picture of one of their staff online, and one of the cyber criminals noticed that their password was stuck on a sticky to the top of their computer. And just because of that photo, they were able to attack that organization. So as much as we joke about it a little bit, it is really something to consider and to think about in your day-to-day activities. And how are you at risk and where do those risks lie in your clinic?
Yeah. So the passwords are a big rock that we need to get in place in our clinics, and the other is how do we approach emails? How do we basically take a look at whether we should be engaging with a message that comes into our busy inboxes? So Cindy, I'm not sure if you can want to talk through this, or do you want me to?
Yes, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, go ahead.
So we wanted to just give you guys a chance to, so here's an email that's come through. Is this legit? Is it not? What would you look for if this came into your office? And again, everyone is really busy. We recognize how overburdened clinics are and how busy your day-to-day activities are. So this comes in and again, we talk about that social engineering piece and that human curiosity of like, oh, I'm just going to check really quickly. I have 2 minutes between patients. Let's just click to see what happens. So this is an example. Just take a quick minute and look through this. And is there anything that what would you do? How would you assess this to make sure that this is a safe email to pursue? I'll just give you a minute to think about that.
I've already given a clue because I clicked the mouse.
So one of the things when we look at that, and maybe Leanne, I'll just get you to advance and to pop up some of these next. What are you going to look for? So you're going to look at your sender. You're going to look to see, is this somebody who you recognize, who you trust, and does that email address make sense? A lot of times it's just the person's name that pops up. But when you hover over top of it, it tells you the email. And, you know, I've had it where my email has gone out to somebody and a friend of mine, and they said, Cindy Elliott, okay, yes, I know this person, I'm going to click. But if they had hovered over top, they would have seen that it was not my email address at all. It was someone else's completely. And so you're going to look for that. You're going to hover over that email and you're going to make sure, is that secure? And then there's the warnings. We get these warnings that are automated into some of our email systems. Not everybody does. And in those free email accounts, we don't always get it. But we have a tendency to just gloss right over. We know that they're there and we still don't pay attention. And so really pay attention to that. See, is there an alert there that you should do a double check on this? And all of those links and attachments within your emails, hover over top, make sure it makes sense. Is this taking you to the right site? And if ever you're in doubt, go to that site directly. Don't click on the link. Don't click on that picture. Don't go forward with it. Take a step back and really evaluate it. So avoid clicking on those links, be wary of your email attachments, and don't reveal that information, your personal, your financial information, when you're responding to an email address of someone that you're not really sure about. You know, verify that authenticity of the sender. And use those trusted sources. Make sure that they're up to date. Make sure that they're fact-based. So, you know, if this was a COVID-19 and you're looking for PPE, make sure that you really know who you're engaging with. Trusted sources aren't going to ask you for your personal information in that way. So just make sure you're really taking a look through, looking at those links, and always take a pause, hover, and see where it's coming from.
Erin,
So
did you have anything to add?
There was 6 different areas that you could have seen that this was not a legitimate email. And we have used this in the past, actually, with when we're engaging with our participants and customers, and many people fall for this, thinking that this is legitimate, or are so curious that they click through. So again, preying on that humanness that we all have.
My only comment, I like this. If we do this well, this is good hygiene. We're covering off so much of the fundamentals. But I smile to myself because this is a game of whack-a-mole. Hackers are getting more devious, more malicious. I was talking with, it was the city of Burlington here in Ontario, who this is public, they'd fallen victim to something exactly like this, but in their case, it was targeting a CFO and it cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. What did it come back to? How effectively are we sussing out whether somebody was impersonating who has access to the checkbook? Hackers aren't always that greedy. So we have seen in small law offices, for example, people targeting individuals with signing authority to simply get access to a few $1,000s worth of gift cards on Amazon. So, you know, it may be that the physician had that Gmail account. It's not part of the clinic email address, but they still use it every so often. And some of these things don't always pop up. So I only can echo the sentiment. These are things that you have to internalize, and then you have to still continue to think a little bit about what the content of the message is when you come through. We're trusting people by nature, so this stuff matters.
Excellent. And that really speaks to, if you look at all of the elements that you could need to find where something's not quite right, and some of it's very creative, one letter change in an address, and our brains are meant to sort of assume what something is without the details required. So this is a really tricky area. And really the best strategy to attack this, to make sure our clinics are safe, is really about training our teams. You know, the ability to take a look at what the risks are and helping them gain comfort. And the other piece is also about what type of culture we have. So whether a breach that's activated with a link is noticed right away or not makes a really big difference in outcomes. So having somebody close the computer and walk away and hoping it disappears is not something we want in any of our organizations when it comes to cybersecurity breaches. Aaron, do you have anything to add in terms of the training component and what you've seen?
Yes, I do. I think in terms of what makes for good training around phishing and spear phishing, again, it's a matter of teaching people what to look for and where to be suspicious. But I think that there's a nice blend of kind of technology in here as well. So for those of us who are still using some, as Cindy, you mentioned, the free email services, the Yahoos, the Hotmails, the Live.coms, the Gmails, those are targeted systems. And so while they do have their own controls built into place, we can't trust that using commercial technology is going to do this kind of stuff for us. There's no excuse for us to not pay attention to some of these core areas too.
And then the second strategy, in addition to training our teams, is really sound policies and procedures. I think I'm on the wrong slide here, guys. I just looked over to my thing here. There we go. So the sound policies and procedures, and this would be checklists. Aaron mentioned a little while ago, you know, those top 10. What are you doing as regular approach to policies when you add new technology? What types of things are being thought about as you go forward when updating your operating systems? You need to have established procedures for that, very accessible, and that your staff are all very aware of. And then, of course, define steps to take if a breach occurs. Immediate response makes a big difference on the damage, as I mentioned earlier. Aaron, I think yesterday you had mentioned about the checklist. Was there anything else you wanted to add around the sound policies and procedures?
Yeah, well, I like the checklist. I mean, I think you'll talk about that in a little bit too, in terms of kind of when you go into what the Sage's Shield looks like. But due diligence is important, right? So if we imagine what happens when and if there is some sort of a breach or security incident, we're now in the scenario of saying, how do I respond back to my privacy commissioner if I'm required to my healthcare regulators if I'm required to, and some of the things that they look for, it's not just technology. It's, did you show that you actually had clear policies and practices around privacy and security? Did you actually communicate in your clinic to your staff, to your partners, that these are the things that one must needs do if you're going to connect to and share information with us? And so this people process technology angle really applies here. The strategy is that any clinic has an obligation to show that their program for privacy and security starts with understanding who is responsible and ensuring that all of the staff and stakeholders are engaged and aware. And we can only do that if we've got some fairly simple policies and procedures to do that. Emphasis on simple, because a lot of the guidance that's out there from the market is not right-sized for clinics and sometimes difficult to digest.
Excellent. And just to continue on that third piece of people, process is technology. And you know, the bottom line is very few clinic owners are really prepared to be able to make the structure and the architecture that is secure. So there are, it's a demand, and in fact, in terms of a profession, it's really having a hard time backfilling open spaces. But IT professionals are really there in a consultative capacity to make sure that your setup is appropriate and optimal in terms of security. So we certainly all have a role to play. We do know there's competing priorities for our time, you know, the myriad of clinical changes and all that goes on in the running of a clinic has a lot of bandwidth that takes our attention. This is important. We can certainly approach it with a minimalist, I guess, amount of time, but it is so key to being able to make sure that your patients are safe, your clinics are safe, and your PHI is safe. We want to raise that awareness. We want to learn from other sectors. We can't prevent every single attack, but we certainly know that we can prevent a large number of them in moving forward. So Cindy, do you want to take it away for these couple of slides? Yeah.
And I am cognizant of time right now, so I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end as well, so that you guys can ask those questions. So earlier in the year, when COVID first began, I know the SMA did send out a few courses that we had developed just to help clinics as they move to this virtual care environment during COVID and rapidly trying to adjust to the changing landscape. So there's 2 free e-learning opportunities that we had sent out through the SMA, and they're still available, but they're to train you and your staff on some of those basics around cyber safe habits. And in those courses, here's a few of the habits that we'll share with you, but please feel free to go back and check those out after this webinar with your team. And really implement some of these in your day-to-day activities. So 3 key tips to defending against, for those, sorry, one backup, sorry, Leanne. 3 cyber safe habits that you can engage with in virtual care. So really think about how you're logging on. Do log on better. Use your multi-factor authentication and really be conscious of which device you're logging in with. Your work extends beyond your clinic walls if you're taking your laptop home and working on a Wi-Fi connection. So really be conscious of that. So connect with care. Make sure that you have a secure VPN or that the remote access solutions are really secured. And don't get out of date. Make sure that you're doing those regular updates. We see that in attacks all the time. Those became the phishing was the phishing attacks, or that clinics or hospitals are targeted because they have out-of-date equipment. So really make sure that you have your computers, your phones, any of your applications up to date, and make sure that you have your backups in place and that you test them to make sure that they actually are backing up appropriately. So if you need to rely on them, you can access it. And then we're also going to go into 3 key tips to defend against a phishing and malware attack. So again, don't click on those links of attachments. Be extra cautious when you're verifying the sender, and don't assume that your provider handles all your cybersecurity risks for you. We hear that all the time. You know, I don't have any risk because I have an EMR, and my EMR vendor assumes all that risk. And as much as they do have a role to play in that, you are responsible as well. So make sure that you really understand where your risk starts and where your EMR's risk starts, and where their coverage and security extends.
Perfect. So you'll see here on your screen right now a quick screen capture of our Sage's Shield. It's just literally launched this week. It's a 2.0 version of Sage's first cybersecurity and privacy offering. We've really listened to the feedback from physicians and their healthcare teams about what type of interactive platform would be helpful. We heard that being able to access on phones is really important. Brief modules that you can go to and come back to so that you're not locked into having to sit tight if something changes in the clinic. We offer 3 sort of pillars that we focus on with this platform. The one is training. It is very specific to healthcare. It's the only platform that we're aware of that focuses on the needs for healthcare professionals. We talk about privacy. We actually have a privacy officer curriculum and support ongoing engagement so that the conversation keeps going. We really support the vigilance, that awareness of what's happening in the environment. I'll show you the dashboard that just highlights those risks. It's all visual and very quick to look at, but I wanted to give you a framework for it. And then, of course, those checklists, policies, procedures that we have in the resource library. So what I'm going to do right now is pull over my
And while you're doing that, maybe, Leanne, I'll just mention a few other things. So this is a subscription-based service. So because we know that training and education and awareness isn't a one and done type of environment, that you need to can constantly be engaging in this to reinforce those learnings and to make sure that you're up to date and on the latest threats and all that relevant information, so that you engage your entire team in this, because again, as we said, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so everybody in your clinic needs to be a part of this program.
Yeah, exactly. So what you'll see, I hope you can see it on your screen. Do you see a thermometer with some red at the bottom? So this is the dashboard that you access from when you're in the platform. It popped up first, so I thought I'd just touch on it quickly. We have an assessment of the environment, what's happening in the healthcare environment, and what are the threats like. You know, as Aaron mentioned, we're much more significant now than we were last year, and it's not anticipated that's going down. In fact, it's likely going to be going up. We have the SAGES Shield, which is the gauge to the right. That looks at the individual learner's preparedness, how ready they are, what knowledge they have to be able to make the best decisions they can to help protect their clinic, their patients, or themselves. We get course shields down below that every time they finish a module, they get a visual on that, as well as a phishing. We push through phishing education every month, so it's always top of mind. We review the whys. You know, why is this a fish? Why is it not a fish? As part of that review, along with some of the core learning objectives. We have the SAGES Shield news feed. We populate this with Canadian data. What's happening in healthcare? What's happening in the cybersecurity and privacy? What's making the news? And it's all in one place. And then on the bottom right, with every email that your staff registers with for the SAGES Shield, we do a breach report for them. Has their email been used in an organization or with I guess we'll call it an app, the app world, where they've been breached and it's now floating out there? If it is, the risk is higher. Passwords need to be changed right away. And we monitor that every time they log into the system. So here is the, well, we'll go to the curriculum next because that's what's showing up on my slide. I'll just put on one of the modules here really quickly. I'm not going to put the sound on. But this is basically an idea of what it looks like. It can be accessed from your handheld when you're in the clinic. We'll just go yes here, or it can be accessed on a desktop if that's available. I'm going to go here to show you quickly. We have all of the slides. You can navigate very easily for all of the content. Every one of our modules has a learning objectives established. Can you guys hear that sound? No. Okay. I'll stop it. I can hear it. I knew I didn't set it up that was accessible to WebEx. So those learning objectives have been developed in tandem with the Scientific Planning Committee. We are in pursuit at this time. We're submitting application for accreditation for both colleges. We do a full complete review once the content is done, where we review all of the material in a summary, and then we actually do a quiz. So there's 7 questions per quiz. And when those quizzes are completed, they can get 1 wrong and they can repeat it as often as possible. A certificate comes with every one of the modules, and then that can be exported and reporting for your administrators so that they're really able to take a look at the tracking. You know, we spoke to that earlier around those privacy requirements. I'm just going to X out of that, and then I'll go in really quickly to the dashboard where we'll look at the resources.
Leanne, I just wanted to mention too that these are all really short modules because we recognize that everybody's busy in their day-to-day activities, and so it's something that you can just engage in really quickly. You know, 5 to 15 minutes. You can start and stop and pick up where you left off. So as you engage in your day-to-day activities, it's a quick snippet of information that you can digest and then move on.
And they're 6 to 15 minutes generally, so they are really quite a range of flexible times. They can finish them, as Cindy indicated, when they want to. And then we have a digital resources. This is, those binders of policies to complement the physical binders in case you're ever locked out of your systems. But we've got the cybersecurity resources, general resources, policy templates, privacy resources, as well as checklists. And this is an ongoing, I guess, data bank for all of the clinics that are engaged with our system. We will have also ongoing interactive, we'll call it webinars, Ask the Experts. We really want to engage the conversation. We don't want to do it overly in terms of the volume of time, but we want to keep it salient and relevant as we keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening. So I'll turn it over, Andrew, to a quick Q&A. And hopefully yesterday it worked from a timing perspective, but let's see what kind of questions we have from those of you here today.
Yeah, so I don't see any questions that have come up in the chats. We had advanced questions yesterday that came in from people who attended that session. So I thought maybe we could just open it up to anyone who has a question right now. If you just want to unmute yourself and ask, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about it if you'd like and fire away.
And so maybe while we're waiting for a couple questions to go in, I'm going to pose a question to everyone as well and just say, are you providing regular formal cybersecurity training to your team or privacy training to your team? And again, this is another question we ask quite frequently, and the answer is generally no. We come up with more often than not that people aren't engaging in that ongoing privacy and cybersecurity training. And so I guess I'm gonna put in another comment while we wait to see if anything else comes in. But I just wanted to say too, we completely recognize that clinics are very busy and that physicians are overburdened. And one of the reasons why we identified this need, this is one of the reasons we identified this need for cybersecurity and privacy program for clinics, because we really wanted to help take that burden off of your shoulders.
And we had a question yesterday, Erin, I think that you answered towards the end of the call. That was around when you were putting up new engagement tools on your websites, on your clinic websites, what types of things should you be concerned about?
Yeah, that was a good question. And I find, in a lot of clinic environments, we don't even know what question to ask. We have a general concern, but we're not sure how to phrase the question for privacy or security considerations. And I suppose, like in many other fields, if we're not asking precisely the right question, it's difficult to know what to look for. But there's a general sense of concern. Any clinic that is moving online is now being presented with multiple options on how to do intake, how to have surveys, how to get engaged with partners and with patients. And in any of those circumstances, the question that was posed yesterday is, is this good enough? Is this appropriate? So some of the tools, to be able to say, well, here's that mental checklist to go through, make sure we have encryption and authentication and logging and all of that stuff. That's important, but it's hard sometimes to know what question to ask and answer. And the fundamentals still come back to making sure that you understand where that cybersecurity risk is. I think it was Cindy or maybe Leanne who had said something about don't expect your IT provider to do things for you. I would echo that sentiment with this question. If you are thinking there's a new way for me to do appointment reminders or to communicate with clinicians or physicians, and an IT provider or an EMR vendor is offering that to you, it does not let you push the risk of a privacy or security breach downstream. And sometimes the opposite can happen, where those providers may have a breach and that could impact you as well. So I love the question for any time you're looking at doing something new with data in and out. Is this appropriate? And seek for some good advice. Look for some good guidance with that regard.
I'll unmute myself. It's Mateen Razi. I've got my hand up. Is it a good time for a question?
Yes, I was just going to ask you to go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. So I suspect physicians like myself, it's more common than not, are using multiple devices between different environments. At work, in a more controlled security environment, at home, and other places. and unrestricted networks as well. Is there any onus on the user of such devices to maintain a certain element of hardware health and software health as well for security? In other words, is there any liability of using these different devices across platforms and environments?
I can give you a partial answer to that question, Mateen. I wouldn't speak to the liability side. I think that's got legal implications. But in terms of the onus and the expectation, the quick answer is yes. Again, it comes back to the fact that you might be using a personal device. Perhaps you're working at a hospital part-time, you have your own clinic, you're moving around, and that one device is connected to multiple areas. So you do have an obligation to maintain that hardware health, that software health, fundamentally. The providers that you work with, for example, here in Ontario, we partner with Ontario Telemedicine Network a lot. Organizations like that try hard to make sure that their partners understand their obligations, but you have this notion of negotiated risk and kind of second and third party risk. And that's what I hear you talking about, Mateen. So it would not be entirely appropriate for one entity to say, well, that's all Mateen's fault. He's using an old version of an iPhone. We couldn't patch it. But there is some shared risk and accountability there. And this is becoming more and more complex. So the fundamental is that I think you need to take accountability for whatever you are working with and operating. And that does mean keeping things patched and maintained and updated.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I appreciate it. And that's pretty much a line along which I was headed. You know, as a lot of us, hardware changes so fast these days. Within 2 years, the device you had was obsolete. So from that perspective, what do you do? I mean, if the security profile, the risk is that much greater with older hardware and software that can no longer be accommodated, is it a shared burden of cost as well for organizations to provide access to the latest hardware and software?
One of the most common issues that we see when we look at doing cybersecurity assessments in clinical environments is that there's more legacy infrastructure, more dated technology than we like to see. And it is a sad fact that the treadmill is moving faster and faster. So that newest version of iPhones that was released, the new operating system yesterday, that means that there's a timer on devices that are now 3 years old. When they cannot be updated, that means they are less secure. The fact is that EMR vendors and technology providers in digital health are motivated to move to the cloud and use the latest and greatest technology. So the unfortunate answer is that there's probably a built-in cost to maintaining current software and hardware, not only for being able to use those medical online services, but absolutely from a privacy and cybersecurity perspective. That situation will not change. Moving to the cloud will not remove the risk of using dated software. So this is a factor for any organization to think of.
Very quick thank you for all of you guys. I often see IT services underfunded, skeletal, bare bones, and not given a lot of importance until it's time for crisis. And I often find that people who have no business having very expensive equipment, their equipment far exceeds anything that the IT colleagues are brandishing. So kudos to you for carrying on the work. Thanks.
And I just wanted to add too, I think, I mean, the big goal for this program is also to help everybody set that foundational piece for their cybersecurity and privacy program so that the clinics are operating from a place of preparedness and not a place of panic. So if a breach does occur, you're ready to go. You have a plan in place and you can mitigate that risk. And that your team is engaged. We've changed the culture. So we're not going, I spoke to one health authority and they said, you know, I've got this many 15,000 foes in my fold. And we really need to change that culture. We really need to think of it that we're a team, we're in this together and we're going to mitigate risk together. So we're going to bring that level of awareness up and change that knowledge and translate that knowledge across all levels of participants in our organization. So everybody's working together to really fight this battle against cyber terrorism.
And I see that Claire has a question here, and it does say just assess current setups and advice or weaknesses. Is this in person? Does this come with the subscription? So no, our $3.50 I guess, per seat per month cost, includes that ongoing education and the evaluation and those features that come with it. But we do have the ability to refer you to organizations such as Aaron's that does offer some of the other value, which would be like whether it be a PIA or assessing your technology. Aaron, my understanding is a lot of that assessment can be done remotely. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can be. And again, I think having access to kind of fora like these so that clinics can start making sure that they've internalized those top 10s, that goes a long way. You know, that 80-20 rule of making sure that you've got access to at least curated content so that you know how to separate the wheat from the chaff, that really matters. So I think that kind of stuff getting built in helps kind of lower the burden to work with subject matter experts. But most of the kind of assessment work that Leanne is talking about can be done remotely, and sometimes they can be very quick conversations to help make a decision around whether you're doing the right thing or not.
Thanks. I saw that Dr. Dattani had put a few comments in the chat. Thanks, Dr. Dattani. I think you had your questions answered about the monthly cost. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to. I want to thank Leanne and Cindy and Aaron for presenting today. I think this is really valuable, and thanks everybody for coming. And we hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much
Andrew.
for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.